Peter the Great and his son Alexei never got along. Peter neglected his boy, while Alexei's mother taught him to despise his father. But still, no one could say Alexei deserved Peter's horrific betrayal. Born in Moscow in 1672, Peter was Tsar Alexei of Russia's 14th child. Despite being so low on the food chain, his father took a keen interest in the boy. For the first 4 years of his life, Peter enjoyed the kind of lavish childhood you'd expect from Tsarevich. Then, well, things took a turn. Tsar Alexei died when Peter was just 4 years old. Peter's 15-year-old brother, Fyodor, took the throne next. But here's the thing. Fyodor was a weak and sickly child who had grown into a weak and sickly teenager. And unfortunately, in the 17th century, weak and sickly basically meant your life was a coin flip. Things in Russia weren't planning on getting too used to Tsar Fyodor, if you know what I mean. Fyodor managed to hang on for a few years before succumbing to an illness. That's when Peter's life got very interesting. Here's what you need to know. Tsar Alexei had 2 wives. Those 2 wives had families, and both of those families wanted their eldest kid to be the next Tsar. So even though Peter's older brother, Ivan, should have been the next Tsar, his family had other plans. They had an advantage, too. This candidate, Ivan, was, let's say, not of sound mind. Finally, the Russian boyars made the call. The 10-year-old Peter would be the next Tsar. The only problem was, some people were furious about it. Peter didn't only have brothers, he also had 6 older half-sisters, and not all of them were happy with the whole only boys can inherit the throne thing. One of those sisters, Sophia, decided to do something about it. No punk little 10-year-old half-brother of hers was getting his grubby little hands on Russia if she had anything to say about it. Sophia convinced the Streltsy, the elite Russian military corps, to rise up in rebellion. Next, she showed Peter's family just how brutal she could be. Peter the Great witnessed horrors no child should see. Sophia had many of Peter's closest relatives and friends murdered during her violent coup. Even worse, Peter was personally on hand to see some of these slayings. Such a horrific experience might have broken another child, but Peter the Great was not like most. Soon enough, he would be the one committing the atrocities. Sophia wanted to rule Russia, but she couldn't be so bold as to proclaim herself Tsarina. Only not when she still had brothers. Instead, she forced the boyars to name her half-brother Peter and her full brother Ivan as co-czars. And while they came of age, who would run the country as regent? Why, Sophia, of course. Tsars can't spend their days playing with toys. They need to get married and have babies. After Peter's will, his mother pushed him into a marriage with Eudoxia Lupakina, the daughter of a minor Russian noble. Now, maybe Eudoxia thought she'd hit the jackpot. One day, she was a nobody aristocrat. The next, she was the Tsarina of Russia. Unfortunately, this was no fairy tale. This was more like a horror story. What can we say? Peter the Great really didn't want to marry Eudoxia Lupakina. He never treated her well, and they remained cold and distant for the duration of their marriage. But that doesn't mean Peter wasn't interested in women, just not his wife. He quickly took a Dutch woman named Anna Mons as his mistress. Unlike his wife, Peter adored Anna, and that brought a lot of power and influence to her and her family. But first, Peter needed to get real power. By the summer of 1689, Peter was 17, unhappily married, and finally tired of playing with boats. He was ready to take what was his. Though it was all happening behind the scenes, there was a Cold War breaking out in Russia. Peter versus Sophia. But who would come out on top? I think you already know the answer. Surprise, surprise. There were lots of people in Russia who despised the autocratic Sophia and her machinations. They flocked to Peter's side, and after a power struggle, the Tsar came out on top. His retaliation against Sophia was devastating. Peter forced her to forsake her name, her titles, and her position in the royal family. Then he locked her away in a convent where she quickly wasted away, passing within 6 years. Now it was finally time for Peter to take control. Or was it? Even though Sophia was gone, Peter still didn't rule Russia outright. Sure, he still had a Kozar in his older brother Ivan, but that's not what we're talking about. No, it was Ivan's mother Natalia. Who was the real rival? Still kicking around after all these years, she ruled in her son's stead. It was only after Natalia passed in 1694, followed soon after by Ivan 2 years later, that Peter finally got the keys to the castle. By that time, he'd grown into a formidable young man indeed. Near the Great was a force of nature, and he was about to start proving it. When Peter finally took charge in Russia, he looked out at his tsardom, and he didn't like what he saw. It was now almost 1700, and compared to the West, Peter thought Russia was still in the Stone Ages. He soon implemented vast reforms that touched almost every aspect of Russian life. His goal was to bring Russia into the 18th century. Well, plenty of people liked things the way they were. Things were about to get bloody. Surprise, surprise, when Peter the Great tried to completely change everything about Russian life in the blink of an eye, people revolted. Rebellions sprang up all across Russia, but Peter the Great was not someone you wanted to cross. He must have learnt a thing or two from his older sister Sophia, because the brutal tactics he used to put down rebellions struck fear into the hearts of anyone who thought about disobeying him. The little boy who had seen his own family members slaughtered in front of him was now butchering rebels by the thousands. Oh, and he was a daddy too. Alexei Petrovich, Peter's son and heir, was born in 1690, but Peter didn't exactly dawd over the boy. He was out modernizing Russia. While he was out modernizing Russia, he left his wife and son by their lonesome. And anyone who says that absence makes the heart grow fonder never met these two. Eudoxia despised her husband for abandoning her, and she raised her son to hate him just as much. After their time apart, Peter turned to the next order of business: divorce. He'd never wanted to marry Eudoxia anyway, and now that he was the head honcho, he figured he'd do whatever he wanted. He dropped her like a bag of hammers and banished her to a convent. He'd spent 9 miserable years married to him, given him a son, and now she had to become a nun against her will. But Peter wasn't done ruining her life just yet. His cruelest act was yet to come. At first, you might think Eudoxia got lucky. The convent where Peter sent her didn't particularly care to force her to become a nun against her will, at least not in the traditional sense of the term. The former Tsarina got to live a fairly normal life. She even found herself a lover, but oh, that poor, poor man, he had no idea what he was getting into. Peter the Great expected his ex to be living a miserable life as a nun, not sleeping around with some local hunk. When he found out about the affair, he reacted in the way you'd expect him to. He had Eudoxia's lover executed, but not just by some simple hanging. According to legend, he had the man slowly impaled on a stake. Oh, and he made Eudoxia watch. And yet somehow, that barely even makes the list of top 10 most disturbing things Peter the Great ever did. After his fling with Anomons and a rotating cast of mistresses, Peter finally found something resembling love with his second wife, Catherine. But he was still Tsar, and of course, he just had to have some mistresses. He started seeing Mary Hamilton, one of his wife's lady-in-waiting, in 1713. She was gorgeous and exciting, and Peter had to have her. They embarked on a passionate affair. For a few years there, things looked pretty good for Mary Hamilton. She lived a lavish life, and she even had the Tsar's ear. But remember how people around Peter the Great tended to die absolutely horrible deaths? Well, it was probably for the best if Peter the Great didn't know your name. When one of Hamilton's ex-lovers happened to get arrested, he accused her of adultery and abortion. Now that was already a crime in Russia, but there was a chance that Hamilton's child might have been Peter's. After brutally extracting a confession from her, Peter had his lover beheaded. But in classic Peter the Great fashion, he had to do it in the most messed-up way possible. According to legend, Peter promised his one-time lover that he would not allow the executioner to touch her after the deed was done. The sword fell, Peter strolled over, picked up Hamilton's head, and spoke to it for a while. Then he gave it a kiss, before simply throwing it away. And I hate to say it, but that's still not the most twisted thing he ever did. In 1723, Peter the Great's health took a turn for the worse. Specifically, he started having problems with his urinary tract and bladder. Okay, that's not ideal, but it gets so much worse. The following summer, doctors performed surgery to ease his pain and released 4 pounds of blocked urine. I cannot even begin to imagine the relief. Even after having his surgery, Peter didn't get much better. He stayed bedridden for months until he couldn't take it anymore. By October of 1724, he decided he was cured. He left his bed and decided to do his favorite activity, performing lengthy inspections of the various building projects across his city. Doesn't that sound like a good time? Despite his own insistence, Peter was far from cured. He worked himself to the bone all autumn and winter, and by January his uremia had returned. Unfortunately, you can only pull the old remove 4 pounds of urine trick once. He gave his last breath sometime in the early hours of February 8, 1725. Peter the Great was no more, but at least he had his son, Alexei, to take over for him. Right? We've finally reached the main event. It is time to discuss the darkest stain on Peter the Great's legacy. Peter the Great expected his son to be as dedicated to the new Russia as he was. Once Alexei was old enough, he worked the boy to the bone, sending him all over Russia on one errand or another. So Alexei had already hated his father. Then Peter went and sent him on all these grueling campaigns in service of a new Russia that Alexei didn't even want. Anyone could see this father-son relationship was in the toilet, but I doubt anyone foresaw what Peter would do to his own son. By 1715, Peter and Alexei's relationship was at an all-time low. Peter wrote Alexei a stern letter, threatening to cut him off if he didn't get on board with the whole new Russia thing. Alexei's reply was pitiful. He wrote back offering to renounce his claim to the throne in favor of his own son, Peter II. By this point, Peter was out of patience. He agreed as long as Alexei would agree to become a monk. Either way, he told Alexei to join him right away. No more funny business. And what did Alexei do? More funny business. Alexei wasn't sure if he could handle becoming a monk, but he definitely knew he didn't want to join his father. So he ran away. He fled to Vienna, where he had an ally in his brother-in-law, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Charles knew better than to get involved in Russian politics, but he also knew Peter was totally insane and might very well murder his own son. Against his better judgment, Charles helped Alexei, stashing him away in a castle in Naples. How do you think Peter took it? Peter was furious when he found out Charles had helped his son, but he blamed Alexei for it more than Charles. His own son rebelling against him and taking refuge with a foreign power? That was too humiliating to take, so he put his best man on the job. Count Peter Tolstoy was essentially Peter's fixer. If Peter needed something shady done, he turned to Tolstoy. Tolstoy went to Naples personally. What he said to Alexei is lost to history, but whatever it was, it worked. Alexei Petrovich agreed to return to Russia, but only if Peter agreed to not punish him at all, and to let him live out his life quietly and comfortably on his estate with his mistress Afrosinia. Peter, excited to have this whole humiliating affair behind him, agreed immediately. But Peter had an incredibly cunning ace up his sleeve. He lied. The second that Alexei stepped back on Russian soil, Peter had him locked up and put to the question. Sure, He'd agreed that he wouldn't punish Alexei, but if Alexei was guilty of treason, then all bets were out the window. And the thing about Peter's methods is they were really good at getting whatever confession you wanted out of people. Peter the Great had done some awful things before, but he really went off the deep end during the whole Alexei affair. He dragged his ex-wife Eudoxia out of her convent and had her tried for adultery. Anyone who had ever been friends with Alexei was impaled or broken on the wheel, or whatever other nightmare execution Peter dreamed up for them. Any name that left Alexei's lips met the same horrific fate. His servants had their tongues cut out, but after all that, there was still no actual evidence that Alexei had done anything wrong. So, Peter just kept going. After weeks of unimaginable torment, the worst thing they could get Alexei to admit was that he had at one point wished his father was dead. To Peter, that was tantamount to treason, but not quite a good enough reason to embark on this whole gruesome affair. Even after a court declared Alexei guilty of treason and sentenced him to death, Peter still didn't quit. He needed Alexei to admit to it all, as if to prove to himself that all of this was worth it. Well, in the end, fate made the decision for him. Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich returned to Moscow on January 31, 1718. He endured his father's brutal questioning methods for nearly 5 long months, but in the end, his feeble body simply couldn't take it anymore. 2 days after the courts laid down their sentence, Alexei's heart simply gave out. As for the lineage, when Peter passed, his wife Catherine took the throne, followed by Alexei's son, Peter II. Peter the Great, for all of his horrible, horrible flaws, did certainly leave his mark. Under his watch, the Tsardom of Russia grew into the formidable Russian Empire, making himself the first emperor of all Russia. He accomplished more than perhaps any other Tsar or Tsarina in Russia's history. And he was a horrible man. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, FactorNet, for more incredible facts about everything.